Officer, my duty under state law is to my patients. You are interfering with emergency medical care.
Lawful order. You are obstructing. That's it. Turn around. You're under arrest.
The heat was a physical presence. It radiated from the asphalt of the Julia Tuttle Causeway, distorting the air above the crushed metal and shattered glass. At 38, Marcus Thorne had spent his entire 12-year career as a paramedic in Miami-Dade, but the brutal midday sun over Biscayne Bay never lost its ability to shock the system. It was 1:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. Dispatch had called it a multi-vehicle pileup with multiple critical injuries. From the moment he and his partner Maya Rodriguez had pulled engine 29 to a stop, Marcus knew critical was an understatement. It was a war zone in miniature. A silver sedan was accordioned against the median. Its driver, a woman in her late 40s, slumped over the airbag, a crimson mask where her face should be. A construction truck was on its side, spilling rebar across 2 lanes of traffic. And a minivan, the epicenter of the carnage, was flipped onto its roof. "Maya, I'm going for the van. You start triage on the sedan," Marcus commanded, his voice a calm, practiced baritone that cut through the cacophony of distant sirens, hissing steam, and the faint, terrified moans of the injured. He moved with a disciplined economy of motion, honed by 1,000 scenes like this. Before becoming a paramedic, he'd been a Marine Corps combat lifesaver. He understood the brutal calculus of trauma, the unforgiving mathematics of the golden hour. Every second wasted was a life slipping away. He grabbed the primary trauma bag and the KED, his eyes scanning, processing, prioritizing. The minivan's driver was a man, mid-50s, hanging upside down, held in place by his seatbelt. His breathing was shallow, agonal, a classic sign of a massive head injury. "Sir, can you hear me? My name is Marcus, I'm a paramedic," he said, his voice level, projecting reassurance even as his mind raced. No response. He checked for a carotid pulse. It was there, thready and fast. Tachycardic. He needed to get him out, get him immobilized, get an airway established. Now! He could hear Maya a few yards away, her voice sharp and clear. "Ma'am, squeeze my hand if you can hear me. We're going to get you out of here." They were a good team. They moved like a well-oiled machine, an extension of each other's thoughts. Marcus was about to call for the hydraulic rescue tools when a new sound sliced through the air. Not a siren, but a shout. "Hey, you! Get the hell out of the way! We need to clear this road!" Marcus glanced over his shoulder. A Miami-Dade police cruiser had screeched to a halt just behind their ambulance, its lights flashing silently. The officer climbing out was young, probably not even 30, with a crew cut and a jawline tight with aggression. His name tag read Vance. His hand was already resting on his taser, a posture of casual dominance. "I'm a paramedic, officer. I have a critical patient trapped in this vehicle," Marcus stated, turning his attention back to the man in the van. The patient's life was the only thing that mattered. Cops, traffic, the gawking onlookers pulling over on the other side of the causeway, it was all just noise. "I don't care who you are. This causeway is a major artery. The chief is screaming about getting it reopened. Start clearing this wreckage now." Vance's voice was a gravelly bark, a sound used for intimidation, not communication. Marcus paused his assessment, a knot of disbelief tightening in his gut. He turned to face the officer fully, keeping his hands visible and open. "Officer, my partner and I are the highest medical authority on this scene until a superior officer or physician arrives. We are in the middle of triage. There are at least 4 critical patients. Moving them without proper immobilization could kill them. We are not clearing anything until every patient is stabilized and transported." He said it without anger, a simple statement of medical and legal fact. This was procedure. This was the law. This was how you saved lives. Vance's face, already flushed from the heat, darkened to a deep red. He saw a challenge, not an explanation. He saw a black man in a uniform telling him what to do, and his entire demeanor bristled with offense. "I just gave you a lawful order, paramedic. You're interfering with a police investigation and blocking a major roadway. Are you refusing to comply?" he said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Marcus and the crushed minivan. The threat was no longer casual. Investigation, Marcus thought. This is a medical emergency. Officer, my duty under Florida state law is to my patients. Your duty is to secure the scene so I can do that. I am not refusing to comply. I am following medical protocol which legally takes precedence right now. You are the one who is interfering. He held the officer's glare for a beat. A silent contest of wills played out over the body of a dying man. He saw a flicker in Vance's eyes, not of understanding, but of rage. It was the look of a man whose authority had been questioned and who had no tool to respond with other than force. "That's it," Vance spat, his hand leaving his taser and reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. "You're obstructing. Turn around. You're under arrest." The words hung in the superheated air, so absurd they barely registered. Under arrest? For what? For triaging patients? For quoting the law? For doing the job he was sworn to do? Marcus felt a surge of cold disbelief, a jarring disconnect from the reality of the scene. A few feet away, a man was dying. Behind him, a woman was bleeding. And here, a police officer was talking about an arrest over a jurisdictional squabble. "Officer Vance, you can't be serious," Marcus said, his voice still steady, betraying none of the adrenaline now flooding his system. "This man will die if I walk away from him. This is not a debate. It's a medical fact." He turned his back on Vance, a deliberate act of dismissal, and refocused on his patient. "Maya, I need the collar and the board. Now, let's get him out." That was the move that sealed it. For Officer Nolan Vance, turning your back was the ultimate act of disrespect. It was a rejection of his authority, his badge, his entire sense of order. He grabbed Marcus's arm, his fingers digging into the muscle with surprising force. "I said turn around. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," he yelled, yanking Marcus away from the minivan. Marcus stumbled, the heavy trauma bag slipping from his other hand and crashing to the pavement, its contents, gauze, saline locks, intubation tools, spilling onto the hot asphalt. The carefully ordered instruments of life-saving now scattered like trash. From the corner of his eye, he saw Maya freeze, her face a mask of shock and horror. She was holding a cervical collar, her gaze darting from Marcus to Vance to the patient in the sedan. She was trapped, forced to choose between helping her partner and helping the injured. "Don't touch me, officer," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. He pulled his arm free from Vance's grasp. "You are obstructing emergency medical care. That is a felony. I am ordering you to stand down and allow me to treat my patient." It was a gamble, a last-ditch attempt to appeal to a sense of reason that he now suspected wasn't there. He wasn't just a paramedic, he was a lieutenant with JFRD. He had seen authority. But Vance wasn't listening. He saw only defiance. The scene was devolving into chaos. A few construction workers from the overturned truck had gotten out and were shouting at Vance. A news helicopter was starting to circle overhead, and several drivers trapped in the gridlock had their phones out recording. The unblinking eye of the public was watching. Vance, perhaps sensing the shift, doubled down. He drew his baton not to strike, but as a show of force. "Last chance! Get on the ground!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. Marcus stood his ground. He would not get on the ground. He would not be intimidated while lives hung in the balance. He raised his hands, palms forward, in a universal gesture of non-aggression. "I am not resisting. I am performing my medical duty," he repeated, the words feeling increasingly hollow against the officer's escalating rage. Vance saw his chance. With Marcus's hands raised, he lunged forward, spinning him around with a practiced violent motion and forcing his arms behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs was shockingly loud. The cold steel bit into Marcus's wrists, tight and unforgiving. The humiliation was immediate and absolute. He was a healer, a public servant, a man who ran toward danger, and he was being cuffed at the most critical moment of his job, treated like a common criminal in front of the very people he was trying to save. "My patient!" Marcus gasped, the air knocked out of him. "Maya, the man in the van, head trauma. You have to stabilize his spine." He could feel Vance's knee pressing into his back. "You should have thought of that before you decided to play hero," Vance grunted, yanking the cuffs tighter. He began marching Marcus toward his patrol car, a perp walk for an audience of stunned motorists and his own partner. Maya, snapping out of her shock, dropped the collar and rushed toward the minivan, her face pale. She knew she couldn't help Marcus now. Her only choice was to try and save the patient he was forced to abandon. As Vance shoved him into the back of the cruiser, Marcus looked back at the scene. He saw Maya working frantically, alone. He saw the woman in the sedan still slumped over, her rescue delayed. He saw the faces of the witnesses, a mixture of outrage and fear. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Officer Vance hadn't just arrested a paramedic. He may have just handed out a death sentence. The back of a Miami-Dade police cruiser is a cage of hard plastic and thick metal mesh. It's designed for containment, not comfort, and it smells faintly of sweat and stale fear. For Marcus, it felt like a tomb. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the suffocating heat. The air conditioner was blasting in the front, but none of it reached the back. Sweat trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes. Through the partition, he watched Officer Vance standing outside, talking into his radio, his posture rigid and defensive. Vance was crafting his narrative, turning a medical emergency into a case of a non-compliant suspect. Marcus had seen it happen before, but always from the other side of the glass. He'd seen officers justify bad arrests with carefully chosen words. Now, those words were being used to describe him. The cuffs were agonizingly tight. He tried to shift his weight to find some relief, but every movement sent a sharp, grinding pain through his wrists and shoulders. He was a man whose hands were his most vital tool. He used them to find a pulse, to insert an IV, to perform CPR, to gently cradle an injured child. Now they were bound and useless. The ride to the station felt like an eternity. Vance drove aggressively, weaving through the traffic that had backed up for miles behind the crash scene. He didn't speak a word to Marcus, just tapped impatiently on his steering wheel, the silence in the car a stark contrast to the blare of his own siren. Marcus watched the city go by in a blur of palm trees and concrete. He thought about the man in the minivan. Had Maya been able to get him out? Had another unit arrived? The golden hour was ticking away, and every minute he spent in this car was a minute stolen from that man's chance of survival. He felt a rage building inside him, a cold, hard anger that was different from the heat of the moment on the causeway. This was the anger of injustice, of a system so broken that a man trying to save a life could be treated this way. He thought about his career, 12 years of impeccable service. He'd received commendations, mentored younger paramedics, taught classes on tactical emergency casualty care. He had built a reputation for being unshakably calm and competent. In 15 minutes, Officer Nolan Vance had put a wrecking ball through all of it. When they arrived at the precinct, Vance paraded him through the main bullpen. The walk from the car to the booking area was a gauntlet of stairs. Other officers looked up from their desks, their faces ranging from curious to contemptuous. They saw the uniform, then the cuffs, and made their assumptions. Paramedic in trouble. Must have done something stupid. The booking process was a systematic stripping of his identity. His wallet, his phone, his keys, his watch, all removed and placed in a plastic bag. Then came the most degrading part. The booking sergeant, a weary-looking man named O'Malley, looked at the arrest report Vance had slapped on the counter. "Obstruction and resisting without violence," O'Malley read aloud, then looked at Marcus. "You a paramedic?" Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "Yes, Sergeant. I was arrested while treating a critical patient at a multi-vehicle accident on the Tuttle." O'Malley grunted, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Vance, who stood by the wall with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Empty your pockets. Take off your belt and your boots." Marcus complied, his movements stiff and awkward with his hands still cuffed behind him. He felt less like a person and more like an object being processed. Fingerprints, mugshot. The flash of the camera felt like a physical blow, capturing him at his lowest point, creating a permanent record of this humiliation. When they finally took the handcuffs off to fingerprint him, he saw the deep, raw welts on his wrists. The skin was broken. He flexed his fingers, trying to work the feeling back into them. O'Malley noticed. "You need medical attention?" he asked, his tone flat, a question asked out of procedure, not concern. "I'm a paramedic, I'll be fine," Marcus said. "But the patients I was forced to abandon might not be. I want it on record that I was arrested during the active treatment of multiple critical trauma patients." O'Malley's pen paused. He looked up at Vance again, a flicker of something, annoyance, doubt, in his eyes. He made a note on the form. It was a small thing, but it was something. It was the first brick in the wall he would have to build to defend himself. After the indignity of the search and the paperwork, they led him to a holding cell. The heavy steel door clanged shut, the sound echoing in the small concrete room. He was alone. He sat on the cold metal bench and put his head in his hands. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion and a terrifying uncertainty. His career, his reputation, his freedom, it was all in the hands of a system that had, in the space of an hour, decided he was the enemy. The silence of the holding cell was a stark contrast to the chaos on the causeway. For Marcus, the quiet was worse. It gave him too much time to think, to replay the scene over and over in his head. Every decision, every word spoken. Could he have de-escalated? Could he have said something different? But every time he came to the same conclusion. He had followed his training. He had prioritized his patient. He had done the right thing, and for that, he was here. He wondered about Maya. She would have been overwhelmed trying to manage a mass casualty incident on her own. He prayed a supervisor or another unit had arrived quickly. He thought about the man in the minivan, his face now a permanent fixture in his mind. Was he alive? The thought was a physical weight on his chest. Meanwhile, back on the Julia Tuttle Causeway, the scene was finally under control, but the damage had been done. Maya, working with a ferocity born of adrenaline and rage, had managed to get the driver out of the sedan with the help of 2 construction workers. Another ambulance and a fire engine had arrived within 8 minutes of Marcus's arrest. The new crew, led by a veteran paramedic named Dave Jensen, took over. Dave looked at Maya, her face streaked with sweat and tears, and then at the police cruiser pulling away. "What the hell happened, Maya? Where's Marcus?" he asked, his voice grim. "They arrested him, Dave," she said, her own voice breaking. "A cop arrested him for trying to do his job." The words sounded insane even as she said them. Dave's face hardened. He'd been on the job for 20 years and had seen his share of jurisdictional pissing matches, but this was a new level of insanity. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Rescue 4. Be advised, the lieutenant from Engine 29 has been taken into custody by MDPD on scene. I am now assuming medical command." The radio operator, a seasoned dispatcher named Clara, sounded flustered. "Rescue 4, repeat that? An officer arrested a paramedic on scene?" "That's affirmative," Dave said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Get me a battalion chief out here now, and notify the union rep." He knew this was above his pay grade. This was a 5-alarm fire of a different kind. While the other medics worked on the remaining patients, Maya retreated to the cab of their engine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. She scrolled to her contacts and found the number for their union representative, a man named Frank Costello. He was a retired firefighter, a bulldog who had spent his life fighting for the men and women on the front lines. He answered on the second ring. "Frank, it's Maya Rodriguez, from Station 29. "Maya, what's wrong? You sound terrible." "They arrested Marcus," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "We were on the Tuttle, a big pileup, a cop, an officer named Vance. He told Marcus to clear the scene. Marcus refused, said we had to treat the patients first, and he cuffed him, Frank. He put him in a car and took him away." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Frank had heard it all, but this was a new one. "Are you serious? He arrested him for what?" "Obstruction. That's what he was yelling." Frank let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. "Okay, Maya, stay calm. Are you okay? Are the patients being cared for?" Yeah, Rescue 4 is here. Dave Jensen is in charge. Good. Dave's solid. Listen to me. Write down everything you remember, every word. The officer's name, his badge number, the time, everything. I'm making a call. We're gonna get him out. Frank hung up and immediately dialed another number, one he kept on speed dial for situations that were spiraling out of control. It belonged to Alani Jackson, a civil rights attorney whose reputation in Miami was legendary. She was known for taking on the police department and winning. Alani, it's Frank Costello. I've got a big problem. One of my best paramedics was just arrested on the scene of an MVA for refusing to stop treating a patient. I need you to get him out. Alani's voice was calm and measured. Tell me everything, Frank. Start from the beginning. As Frank recounted the story Maya had just told him, Alani Jackson was already pulling up the Miami-Dade booking records on her computer. She saw the name, Marcus Thorne, and she saw the charges. This wasn't just a problem. This was a declaration of war. Marcus had been in the holding cell for nearly 3 hours when the metallic screech of the door opening startled him. A guard stood in the doorway. Thorne, you've got a visitor. Your lawyer. Marcus felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. Why? He hadn't even had a chance to make his phone call yet. Frank and Maya must have moved fast. They led him to a small, sterile interview room. A woman was sitting at the table, her back to the door. She stood as he entered. She was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. Mr. Thorne, I'm Alani Jackson. Your union rep, Frank Costello, called me. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and intelligent. They missed nothing. Please, sit. Marcus sank into the chair, the exhaustion of the day washing over him. Thank you for coming. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything just yet, Alani said, opening a sleek leather briefcase and taking out a legal pad. First, let me tell you what I know. You were arrested at approximately 1:30 p.m. on the Julia Tuttle Causeway by an officer Nolan Vance. The charges are obstruction of a police officer and resisting arrest without violence. You've been booked and are currently being held pending arraignment. Is that all correct? Yes, Marcus nodded. Okay, she said, her gaze steady. Now, I want you to tell me exactly what happened, from the moment you arrived on scene. Don't leave anything out. Every word he said, every word you said, tell me everything. For the next hour, Marcus recounted the entire incident. He described the chaos of the scene, his assessment of the patients, the arrival of Officer Vance, the escalating demands, his own attempts to explain medical protocol, and the final violent arrest. He was a trained observer, and he gave his testimony with the same precision he would use to document a patient's vitals. Alani listened intently, her pen flying across the page, only interrupting to ask clarifying questions. Did he ever ask for your identification before demanding you clear the scene? No. His first words were to yell at me to get out of the way. Did you ever touch him or make any physically threatening moves? Never. I kept my hands open and visible. I explicitly stated I was not resisting. And were there witnesses? My partner, Maya Rodriguez, the crew from the overturned truck, and dozens of people in their cars. A lot of them had their phones out. Alani stopped writing and looked at him. Good. This is good. She closed her notepad. Mr. Thorne, Marcus, your arrest was unlawful. It was a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable seizure. More than that, it was a violation of Florida Statute 401.445, which makes it a felony to interfere with emergency medical personnel in the performance of their duties. He didn't just break department policy, he broke state law. The clarity and certainty in her voice were like a lifeline. For the first time since the cuffs had clicked shut, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. So what happens now? Now I get you out of here. I'll have you released on your own recognizance within the hour. The charges will almost certainly be dropped by the DA's office before they even hit a courtroom. They're garbage, and the city knows it. She paused, her expression turning serious. But that's not the end of it. That's just the beginning. True to her word, Marcus was released 45 minutes later. The charges were still pending, but Alani was confident they would vanish. He walked out of the precinct and into the warm evening air, blinking in the fading sunlight. Maya was there, waiting by her car. She rushed to him, pulling him into a hug. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been better," he said, his voice raspy. "What about our patients? The man in the van?" Maya's face fell. "He's alive, Marcus, but just barely. They took him to Ryder trauma. Massive intracranial bleeding. The surgeon said the 10-minute delay in transport, it made things a lot worse. It was touch and go on the operating table." The news hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. The consequences of Vance's actions were no longer hypothetical. A man's life had been irrevocably altered. 2 days later, Marcus sat in Alani Jackson's polished downtown office overlooking the bay. "The district attorney's office has officially declined to prosecute," Alani said, sliding a document across the mahogany desk. "The charges are gone. As far as the criminal system is concerned, this is over." "So that's it?" Marcus asked. "Vance gets away with it?" "Not if you don't want him to," Alani said, leaning forward. "We have a choice to make. We can let this go and you can try to put it behind you. Or we can file a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Nolan Vance and the city of Miami for unlawful arrest, violation of your constitutional rights, and interference with medical care. We can hold them accountable not just for what they did to you, but for what they did to that patient." She let the words hang in the air. "I have to warn you, it will be a long, difficult fight. They will come after your record, your reputation, your personal life. They will try to break you. But if we win, we won't just get you justice. We can force them to change their policies. We can make sure this never happens to another paramedic in this city again." Marcus looked out the window at the city he'd served for over a decade. He thought of the welts on his wrists and the look of terror on his patient's face. The choice was clear. Let's fight. The lawsuit, Thorne versus Vance and the City of Miami, was filed in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida 3 weeks later. The complaint was a dry, clinical document, but it told a story of shocking negligence and abuse of power. It detailed the timeline of the accident, the critical state of the patients, and Officer Vance's deliberate and reckless indifference to human life. It cited federal civil rights statutes and state laws protecting first responders. It demanded punitive damages and, most importantly, a court order mandating policy changes and retraining for the entire Miami-Dade Police Department. The city's response was swift and predictable. Their legal department filed a motion to dismiss, a standard tactic designed to bog down the process and intimidate the plaintiff. The motion painted a completely different picture of the events on the causeway. It claimed Officer Vance was a hero, attempting to restore order to a chaotic scene and prevent further accidents. It portrayed Marcus as an insubordinate and aggressive individual who had actively interfered with a lawful police command. It was a work of fiction, a narrative crafted to protect the city from liability. "They're claiming qualified immunity for Vance," Alani explained to Marcus during a phone call. "It's a legal doctrine that shields government officials from liability unless they violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. They're going to argue that Vance was just doing his job and couldn't have known he was violating your rights." "But he did know," Marcus countered, his voice tight with frustration. "I told him the law. I told him he was interfering with medical care." "I know, Marcus, and we're going to prove it. This is just the first move in a long chess game. We'll file our opposition, and the judge will likely deny their motion. But you need to be prepared. This is what they do. They attack, they deny, they delay." The real battle, however, wasn't being fought in the courtroom yet. It was being fought in the quiet corridors and locker rooms of Miami-Dade Fire Rescue. When Marcus returned to work after a mandatory week of administrative leave, he found the atmosphere at Station 29 had changed. The easy camaraderie, the gallows humor that got them through the tough shifts, was gone, replaced by a tense, awkward silence. Some of his colleagues, the ones he'd known for years, the ones he'd trusted with his life, avoided his gaze. They'd offer a curt nod in the hallway but would fall silent when he entered the kitchen. The whispers followed him everywhere. He's suing the city. He's going after a cop. In the tribal world of first responders, there was an unwritten rule. You don't go after another uniform. Fire, police, EMS, they were all part of the same brotherhood, a thin line against the chaos of the city. By suing a police officer, Marcus had broken that code. His captain, a man who had once been his mentor, called him into his office. "Marcus, you know I support you," he began, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers on his desk. "But this lawsuit, it's making waves. The police union is putting pressure on the city manager. They're saying you're making it harder for cops and medics to work together on scenes. You're putting a target on our backs." "All I did was my job, Captain," Marcus said, his voice even. "A cop pulled me off a dying man and arrested me. What was I supposed to do? Just let it go?" I know," the captain sighed. "But you have to understand the politics of it. You've made some powerful people very angry." The most painful slight came from an unexpected source. During a routine call for a person with chest pains, the responding police officer was someone Marcus knew, an older cop he'd shared coffee with on a dozen scenes. This time, the officer was cold and distant. He refused to make eye contact, communicated in monosyllables, and stood with his arms crossed, a silent wall of disapproval. The message was clear. You are one of them now, the people who sue us. You are the enemy. Maya was his only steadfast ally. She was furious at the way he was being treated. "They're cowards," she seethed one afternoon as they cleaned the ambulance. "They know what that cop did was wrong, but they're too scared to say it out loud because they don't want to piss off MDPD. "It's not that simple, Maya," Marcus said, though her loyalty was a small comfort. "They're worried about their jobs, their pensions. They're worried about being left hanging on a dangerous scene because the police are slow-walking their response." The isolation was a heavy burden. He had always taken pride in his work, in the uniform he wore. Now, it felt like a costume that no longer fit. The city's lawyers were trying to paint him as an aggressor in the courtroom, while some of his own colleagues were treating him like a pariah in the firehouse. He was fighting a war on two fronts, and the emotional toll was immense. But every time he felt the urge to give up, to tell Alani to drop the suit and make it all go away, he thought of the man in the minivan. He thought of the cold steel of the handcuffs and the hot shame of the arrest. And he knew he couldn't back down. This was no longer just about his reputation. It was about a principle that was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. While the city's motion to dismiss was being argued in court, Alani Jackson's legal team launched the next phase of the lawsuit: discovery. It was a slow, painstaking process, the unglamorous grunt work of litigation that rarely makes headlines but often decides cases. It was a formal request for all evidence held by the opposing party. Alani's requests were sweeping and specific. She demanded every piece of documentation related to the incident on the causeway. Officer Vance's complete, unedited body camera footage, the dashcam video from his patrol car, all radio communications, the full, unredacted police report and his handwritten notes, and the witness statements collected on scene. But she didn't stop there. She went after the man himself. She requested Officer Nolan Vance's entire personnel file, from his academy scores to every performance review, commendation, and most importantly, every single civilian complaint filed against him since he joined the force 7 years prior. The city's lawyers fought back at every turn. They filed objections, claimed certain documents were privileged, and produced heavily redacted files. They were burying Alani's team in a mountain of paper, a common tactic known as document dumping, hoping to hide the needle of truth in a haystack of bureaucratic nonsense. But Alani had built her career on dismantling these kinds of stonewalls. Her team of paralegals and junior attorneys worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of purpose, meticulously cataloging every page. The first breakthrough came from the witness statements. They had been collected by another officer on scene, not Vance, and they were devastating. A construction foreman described Vance as out of control and on a power trip. A woman trapped in her car a few feet away stated, "The paramedic was trying to save someone's life, and the cop just attacked him for no reason." Dozens of statements painted the same picture: a calm, professional paramedic being assaulted by an enraged officer. The real bombshell, however, was buried deep within Nolan Vance's personnel file. After weeks of legal wrangling, a judge ordered the city to produce the complete, unredacted records of his civilian complaints. There were 17 of them in 7 years. It was an astonishingly high number. The complaints told a story of a young officer with a dangerous pattern of behavior. There were multiple accusations of excessive force during routine traffic stops. There were complaints about verbal abuse and unwarranted searches. 3 separate incidents involved him unlawfully detaining individuals who had been filming him in public. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen. But the most damning part was how the department had handled it. Of the 17 complaints, 16 had been dismissed as unfounded or unsubstantiated after a cursory internal affairs review. The 17th resulted in a slap on the wrist, a written reprimand, and a mandatory de-escalation training course, which he had completed just 2 months before his encounter with Marcus. "This is the ball game, Marcus," Alani said, laying the files out on her conference table. The table was covered in documents, a paper trail of one man's unchecked aggression. "This isn't about one bad day, this is a pattern. The city knew they had a problem officer on their hands. They knew he had a history of escalating situations and abusing his authority. They had a dozen chances to discipline him, to retrain him, to take him off the street. And they did nothing. They just kept signing off on the paperwork and putting him back in a patrol car. They are just as liable for what happened to you as he is." The discovery process also turned up the internal emails from the police department in the hours after Marcus's arrest. The emails showed a department in panic mode. The police chief, the city manager, the head of the city's legal department, they were all in damage control, trying to spin a story that would protect them. There was no mention of concern for the patients, no discussion of the potential violation of state law. It was all about managing the optics of arresting a paramedic in his uniform. Seeing it all laid out in black and white was profoundly validating for Marcus. For weeks, he had been made to feel like the one who had done something wrong. He had been isolated by his colleagues and painted as a villain by the city. But the evidence told the truth. It was a truth the city had tried to bury under a mountain of paperwork and a wall of silence. Now that truth was about to be brought into the light. The war of discovery had been won. Now the battle would move to the depositions, where the people behind the paper would be forced to answer for what they had done, under oath. After months of delays and legal maneuvering, the city was finally compelled by court order to release the full, unedited body camera footage from Officer Nolan Vance. Alani Jackson and Marcus watched it for the first time together in a small screening room at her law firm. The screen flickered to life, and they were transported back to the chaotic, sun-bleached pavement of the Julia Tuttle Causeway. The footage began with Vance in his car, the wail of the siren deafening as he sped toward the scene. He was muttering to himself, complaining about the idiot drivers and the traffic nightmare. There was an undercurrent of irritation in his voice before he even stepped out of the vehicle. When he arrived, the camera's perspective was jerky as he got out and strode toward the wreckage. The first thing he focused on was not the injured, but the traffic. "This whole damn causeway is shut down," he grumbled. Then his camera turned toward Marcus, who was kneeling beside the overturned minivan. The audio was crystal clear. "Hey, you! Get the hell out of the way! We need to clear this road!" Marcus, not looking up. "I'm a paramedic, officer. I have a critical patient trapped in this vehicle." The contrast was stark. Vance's voice was aggressive, accusatory. Marcus's was professional, focused. The camera captured Marcus turning to face Vance, his hands open and non-threatening. "Officer, my partner and I are the highest medical authority on this scene. We are not clearing anything until every patient is stabilized and transported." "I just gave you a lawful order, paramedic. Are you refusing to comply?" Watching the scene unfold from the officer's perspective, was a surreal and chilling experience for Marcus. He saw himself as Vance saw him, a large black man, calm and resolute, refusing to be intimidated. And he saw the flicker of rage in Vance's eyes, the tightening of his jaw, captured in high definition. The camera recorded everything. It captured Marcus quoting the Florida statute that protected him. It captured his final plea. "Officer Vance, you can't be serious. This man will die if I walk away from him." It captured him turning his back on Vance, not as an act of disrespect, but as an act of prioritizing his patient. And then it captured the violence. The camera lurched as Vance grabbed Marcus's arm. The audio peaked as he screamed, "Turn around! You're under arrest!" The image shook violently as they struggled, the sounds of crinkling fabric, grunts, and the final sickening click of the handcuffs. But the most damning part of the video came after the arrest. With Marcus secured in the back of his car, Vance left his body camera recording as he walked back to the scene. He approached Maya, who was now frantically working on the patient in the minivan alone. Vance, to Maya, "Your partner should have listened. Now maybe you people will understand who's in charge at these scenes." Maya didn't respond, her focus entirely on her patient. Vance then walked over to a fellow officer who had just arrived. His microphone picked up their conversation perfectly. "New officer. What happened? You arrested a medic?" Vance, laughing. "Yeah, this guy thought his fancy paramedic badge meant he could tell me what to do. Had a real attitude problem. I had to teach him a lesson about respecting the badge." The casual cruelty of it, the boastful admission that the arrest was not about obstruction, but about teaching a lesson, was the smoking gun. Vance had confessed on his own camera that his actions were a punitive abuse of power. Alani paused the video. The room was silent. "He just handed us our case on a silver platter," she said, her voice quiet but filled with a cold fury. "This isn't just evidence of a wrongful arrest, Marcus. This is evidence of malice. This will destroy their claims of qualified immunity. A jury will see this, and they will be horrified." Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the frozen image on the screen, his own face contorted in disbelief as the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. The video was more than just evidence. It was objective truth. It was a perfect, unblinking record of the moment his life was turned upside down. It proved he wasn't crazy. It proved he wasn't the aggressor. It proved he had done everything right in a situation that had gone terribly wrong. The city's lawyers had seen this same video. They knew what it showed. And yet, they had continued to fight, continued to smear his name, continued to protect the officer who had so blatantly and proudly abused his power. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he was going to win. The deposition of Officer Nolan Vance took place in a sterile, air-conditioned conference room that felt a world away from the heat of the causeway. Vance sat at one end of a long, polished table, flanked by two attorneys from the city and a representative from his police union. He wore a crisp suit, a stark contrast to the uniform he'd worn on the day of the arrest. He looked confident, almost arrogant, his posture rigid. Across the table sat Alani Jackson, Marcus, and a court stenographer whose fingers hovered over her machine, ready to capture every word. Depositions are not trials. There is no judge, no jury, but the testimony is given under oath and can be just as crucial. It is a chance to question the opposing party, to lock in their story, and to expose its weaknesses before it ever gets to a courtroom. Alani began calmly, her voice even and professional, asking Vance to state his name, his rank, and his years of service. She spent the first hour on his training, establishing the fact that he had been taught the protocols for interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes. He answered her questions with curt, confident replies. Yes, he understood the concept of triage. Yes, he knew that paramedics had authority over patient care. Then, Alani's questions began to sharpen. She directed him to the day of the incident. Alani, "Officer Vance, when you arrived on scene, what was your primary objective?" Vance, to secure the scene and restore the flow of traffic as quickly and safely as possible. Alani, not to assess the condition of the injured or render aid? Vance, that's the paramedic's job. My job is traffic and scene safety. Alani, so your priority was the cars, not the people. The city's attorney objected. Argumentative! But the question hung in the air. Alani moved on, walking him through the incident second by second, using his own police report as a guide. Alani, in your report you state that you repeatedly ordered Mr. Thorne to clear the scene. Is that correct? Vance, yes, he was being insubordinate. Alani, and he responded by explaining that he was treating a critical patient and could not move him. Is that also correct? Vance, he was making excuses. He was obstructing my investigation. Alani, what investigation, officer? The accident report states clearly that the cause of the accident was a blown tire on the minivan. There was no crime being investigated. Is that correct? Vance hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. All accidents are technically investigations. The core of the deposition, however, focused on the body camera footage. Alani had a large monitor set up at the end of the table. She played the video, pausing it at key moments. She stopped on the image of Marcus, kneeling, his voice calm. Alani, Officer Vance, in your training, are you taught to identify the signs of a person in medical distress? Vance, we receive basic first aid training, yes. Alani, and did Mr. Thorne, a trained paramedic with over a decade of experience, tell you that the patient was critical? Vance, he said that, yes. Alani, and yet you chose to ignore his professional medical assessment? Vance, I had to make a command decision. The safety of the entire causeway was at stake. Then Alani played the most damning clip, Vance's conversation with the other officer after the arrest. The room was silent as his own voice filled the air. This guy thought his fancy paramedic badge meant he could tell me what to do. I had to teach him a lesson about respecting the badge. Alani paused the video and looked at Vance. His face was pale, the arrogance gone, replaced by a sullen, trapped expression. Alani, Officer Vance, did you arrest Marcus Thorne because he was obstructing justice, or did you arrest him, in your own words, to teach him a lesson? The union lawyer immediately jumped in. Objection! Don't answer that! But the damage was done. The question, and Vance's refusal to answer it, would be on the official transcript. For 6 hours, Alani relentlessly picked apart his story. She questioned him about the 17 prior complaints, forcing him to admit under oath that he had been accused of similar behavior before. She exposed the contradictions between his police report and the video evidence. She demonstrated that his actions were not driven by procedure or a concern for public safety, but by ego and a need for absolute compliance. By the end of the day, Nolan Vance was a different man. The swagger was gone. He looked exhausted and defeated. He had walked into that room a confident police officer. He walked out a massive liability that the city's attorneys now had to find a way to manage. Marcus watched the entire proceeding in silence, his expression unreadable. He felt no satisfaction in watching Vance's downfall, only a profound sense of sorrow that it had ever come to this. A week later, the roles were reversed. It was Marcus's turn to sit at the head of the conference table and face the city's legal team. They had 2 lawyers present, a senior partner named Arthur Finch, a man in his late 50s with a reputation for being a ruthless cross-examiner, and a younger, ambitious associate. Their goal was simple: to rattle Marcus, to trip him up, to find any inconsistency in his story that they could use to paint him as unreliable, unprofessional, or dishonest. They wanted to create a narrative that he was the one who had escalated the situation, that his actions, not Vance's, were the reason for the confrontation. Finch began with a deceptively friendly tone, asking about Marcus's childhood, his time in the Marines, his decision to become a paramedic. It was a classic tactic, designed to lull the witness into a false sense of security. Marcus, on Alani's advice, remained calm and answered every question with a simple, direct honesty. Then, Finch's demeanor shifted. He began to probe for weaknesses in Marcus's professional record. Finch, Lieutenant Thorne, in your 12 years of service, have you ever been disciplined by the fire department for any reason? Marcus, no, sir. Finch, never had a disagreement with a superior officer? Never been accused of being difficult to work with? Marcus, I have had professional disagreements, as anyone in a high-stress job does, but I have never been formally disciplined. My record is exemplary. Finch then turned to the incident itself, attempting to reframe Marcus's professionalism as arrogance. Finch, when Officer Vance arrived, you considered yourself to be in charge of the scene. Is that correct? Marcus, I was the highest medical authority on scene, yes. My partner and I were responsible for the well-being of the patients. That is our designated role. Finch, so you believe a paramedic's authority supersedes that of a sworn police officer? Alani, objection. That mischaracterizes his testimony and the law. Finch waved a dismissive hand. The witness can answer the question. Marcus, it is not a matter of one superseding the other. We have different roles that are meant to work in concert. A police officer secures the scene so that a paramedic can save lives. On that day, Officer Vance was preventing me from doing my job, which put lives at risk. For hours, they grilled him. They tried to twist his words, to insinuate that he had an anti-police bias, that he was looking for a confrontation. They brought up the fact that he was a large, physically imposing man, a thinly veiled attempt to play on racial stereotypes and suggest he was intimidating. Through it all, Marcus remained unshakable. He never raised his voice, never showed anger. He responded to every question with the same calm, methodical precision he used on a medical call. He was a master of his domain, and the law and medicine were on his side. He explained the concept of the golden hour, the medical necessity of spinal immobilization, the specific signs of distress his patient in the minivan was exhibiting. He turned the deposition into a master class on emergency medicine. The turning point came when Finch tried to question his motives for filing the lawsuit. Finch, Lieutenant Thorne, you're asking for millions of dollars from the city in this lawsuit. Some might say you're just trying to cash in on this incident. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with Finch's for the first time. The friendly facade was gone. Mr. Finch, on the day I was arrested, I was making about $70,000 a year. It's a job I love, a job I was proud of. I would have gladly continued doing that job for the rest of my career. But your client, Officer Vance, put handcuffs on me and pulled me away from a man who was dying because his ego was bruised. He did it in front of my partner, in front of the public, and in front of a dozen cell phone cameras. Then, your office, the city I served, spent the next year trying to destroy my reputation and my career to protect him. You accused me of being aggressive, insubordinate, and a liar. So no, sir, I am not here for a payday. I am here for accountability. I am here to make sure that no other paramedic in this city ever has to choose between doing their job and being arrested. The room was silent. The court stenographer's fingers were the only thing that moved. Finch, for the first time all day, seemed to be at a loss for words. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and looked at his associate. He knew he had lost. Marcus hadn't just been a credible witness, he had been a powerful one. His testimony, combined with the irrefutable evidence of the body camera, had left the city's defense in tatters. The question was no longer whether they would lose the case, but how badly. With the depositions complete and the body camera footage looming over the proceedings, the city's legal strategy shifted from aggressive defense to damage control. They knew that if the video of Vance's confession, "I had to teach him a lesson," was ever played for a jury, the result would be catastrophic. The potential for a massive, multi-million-dollar verdict was no longer a possibility. It was a near certainty. The judge, sensing the shift, ordered both parties into mandatory mediation. Mediation is a form of settlement negotiation, presided over by a neutral third party, usually a retired judge. It's a last-ditch effort to resolve a case without the expense and public spectacle of a trial. The mediation took place at a neutral law office. Marcus and Alani sat on one side of a large conference table. On the other side were Arthur Finch, another city attorney, and a risk manager from the city's insurance company. The insurance representative was the most important person in the room. He held the city's checkbook. The mediator, a respected retired federal judge named Ann Henderson, laid out the ground rules. He would shuttle between the two parties, who would be placed in separate rooms, conveying offers and counteroffers, trying to find a middle ground. The day began with a joint session. Alani gave a powerful 20-minute presentation. She calmly laid out the facts of the case, the strength of their evidence, and the weakness of the city's defenses. She ended by playing a 2-minute highlight reel of the body camera footage, culminating in Vance's damning admission. The color drained from the insurance manager's face. Then, the parties separated. Judge Henderson came into their room first. "They're scared," he said bluntly. "They know they have a significant exposure here. They want to make this go away." He paused. "They've authorized me to make an initial offer. The city is prepared to offer Mr. Thorne $350,000 to settle all claims and dismiss the lawsuit." Marcus looked at Alani. It was a substantial amount of money, more than he would make in 5 years. For a moment, he thought about what it would mean. An end to the stress, an end to the fight. But Alani's expression was stone. "Judge, please inform the city's council that we find their offer to be insulting," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "It does not begin to compensate Mr. Thorne for the public humiliation, the damage to his professional reputation, and the emotional distress he has endured. Furthermore, it does not include the one thing we have demanded from the very beginning: systemic change. We are not just here for money." The judge nodded and left the room. For the next several hours, the dance continued. The city's offer crept up slowly, $500,000, then $750,000. With each offer, Alani's response was the same. "Not even close. And where are the policy changes?" Finch and the city attorneys were growing frustrated. They were used to plaintiffs who would jump at the first life-changing sum of money. They couldn't understand why Marcus wasn't taking the deal. They saw it as a negotiation over dollars and cents. They failed to grasp that for Marcus, it was a fight for his professional soul. Around 4 p.m., the offer finally crossed the $1 million mark. The insurance manager was sweating. This was far beyond the nuisance value they had initially calculated. Alani and Marcus conferred privately. "They're not getting the message," she said. "They still think they can buy our silence. They haven't offered a single concrete policy change. They haven't even agreed to fire Vance." "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "We send them a message they can't ignore," Alani said, a determined glint in her eye. She wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across the table to him. It was an astronomical figure. "Are you serious?" Marcus breathed. "Deadly serious," she replied. "This isn't just about compensating you. This is about punishing the city for what they did. It's about making it so financially painful for them that they have no choice but to change. It's a number that says, we are not afraid to go to trial." When Judge Henderson returned, Alani gave him their counteroffer. "Our demand is $15 million, she said without blinking, and the immediate termination of Officer Nolan Vance, and the implementation of a new court-monitored training protocol for all police officers in Miami-Dade regarding interactions with EMS personnel. That is our final offer. If they refuse, we will see them in court." The judge looked at the number, his eyebrows raising slightly. He knew this wasn't a negotiating tactic. It was an ultimatum. He walked back to the city's room. They could hear raised voices through the wall. The city was finally understanding the magnitude of the mistake they had made. The mediation ended without a deal, but the battle lines had been drawn. The city's lawyers had come to buy a man's silence. They had left with the knowledge that the price of injustice was going to be far higher than they had ever imagined. The failed mediation sent a shockwave through the city's government. The prospect of a public trial, with the body camera footage played on a loop on the evening news, was a political and financial nightmare. The city council held an emergency closed-door session. Arthur Finch and the head of the police department were called in to explain how the situation had gotten so out of control. The city's attorneys had to admit the truth. Their case was unwinnable. The evidence was overwhelming. Their key witness was a proven liability, and the plaintiff was an unimpeachable public servant. A jury would not just side with Marcus Thorne. They would seek to punish the city for its negligence and the subsequent cover-up. The potential verdict could be even higher than the $15 million Alani had demanded. The negotiations resumed, but this time, the tone was different. The city was no longer trying to bully or lowball. They were trying to surrender. The calls were no longer between Alani and the city's litigation department, but between Alani and the city attorney himself. They were desperate to avoid a trial. Over the course of a frantic week, the final terms of the settlement were hammered out. The city fought hard on the final number, but Alani refused to budge on the non-negotiable terms, the policy changes, and the termination of Officer Vance. She knew that without those, any financial settlement would be a hollow victory. Finally, they reached an agreement. The city agreed to pay Marcus Thorne a total of $13.8 million. It was one of the largest settlements for a civil rights violation in the city's history. In addition, the city agreed to terminate Officer Nolan Vance's employment, effective immediately. They also consented to a federal consent decree, a legally binding agreement overseen by a federal judge, which would mandate a complete overhaul of the Miami-Dade Police Department's training and policies regarding interactions with all first responders. The victory was total and unequivocal. The settlement was announced at a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. Marcus stood beside Alani, his face calm and composed as she read a prepared statement. He wore his dress uniform, the same one he had been so proud of, the one that Vance had dishonored. He looked not like a victim, but like a victor. Today's settlement is not just a victory for Marcus Thorne, Alani said, her voice ringing with passion. It is a victory for every paramedic, every firefighter, and every EMT who has ever been bullied, intimidated, or obstructed while trying to save a life. It sends a clear message to the city of Miami and to law enforcement agencies across the country. The badge is not a license to abuse your power, and there will be a price to pay for those who believe it is. When she finished, the assembled reporters shouted questions at Marcus. "Mr. Thorne, what are you going to do with the money? How does it feel to be vindicated?" He stepped up to the microphone, and a hush fell over the crowd. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began, his voice steady. "A year and a half ago, I was just a man trying to do my job. That job is to save lives. What happened on that causeway should never have happened. Not to me, not to anyone. The money is just a number. It's the city's acknowledgement of the wrong they did. But the real victory today is the policy changes. The real victory is knowing that because of this fight, the next paramedic who finds themselves in this situation will be protected, that their patient won't have to suffer because of an officer's ego." Later that day, the official termination letter for Officer Nolan Vance was made public. The internal affairs investigation, which had been conveniently stalled for over a year, was suddenly completed. It found him guilty of multiple policy violations, including gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. His career in law enforcement was over. For Marcus, the news brought a sense of closure, but not joy. He had never wanted to see another man's life ruined. He had only wanted justice. The settlement was the end of a long and brutal chapter in his life. But as he stood there, watching the sunset over the city he called home, he knew it was also the beginning of a new one. He now had the resources and the platform to ensure that his ordeal would not just be a story, but a catalyst for real and lasting change. The price of injustice had been paid, and now the work of building a better system could begin. In the weeks following the settlement, Marcus was inundated with messages from across the country. They came from paramedics in rural Texas, firefighters in Chicago, EMTs in Los Angeles. They all shared similar stories, tales of being bullied by police, of being threatened with arrest for prioritizing patient care, of facing retaliation for standing their ground. They saw his victory as their victory, a sign that the system could, with enough pressure, be held accountable. Marcus realized that his case was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deep systemic problem. He had been lucky. He had a strong union, a brilliant lawyer, and irrefutable video evidence. But what about the first responders who didn't? The ones in small towns with politically powerful police chiefs? The ones who couldn't afford a top-tier civil rights attorney? The thought gnawed at him. The $13.8 million was a life-altering sum of money. But he knew it would feel meaningless if he simply deposited it in the bank and tried to forget the past. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to use his newfound platform and resources to help others who were facing the same battles he had just won. After several weeks of discussion with Alani Jackson and other advisors, the idea for the Thorn Shield Foundation was born. It would be a non-profit organization with a singular, focused mission: to provide legal defense and advocacy for any first responder who faced wrongful arrest, retaliation, or interference for performing their professional duties. Marcus dedicated $5 million of his settlement as seed money to launch the foundation. He hired a small staff, including an executive director who had a background in nonprofit management and civil rights law. Alani Jackson agreed to serve on the board of directors, offering her legal expertise pro bono. The foundation's work was twofold. First, it established a legal defense fund. Any first responder in the country could apply for a grant to cover their legal fees if they were facing a situation similar to Marcus's. The foundation would vet the cases and connect the applicants with qualified attorneys in their area. It was a lifeline for those who felt isolated and outgunned. Second, the foundation focused on education and advocacy. They began developing training materials for fire departments and EMS agencies on the legal rights of first responders, de-escalation techniques for dealing with hostile law enforcement, and the importance of meticulous documentation and body cameras. The first case the Thorn Shield Foundation took on came from a small town in Georgia. A young female paramedic had been arrested for refusing to let a state trooper take custody of a semi-conscious patient from a DUI accident before she could complete her medical assessment at the hospital. The trooper claimed she was obstructing his investigation. The local DA was pursuing the charges, and her small volunteer fire department didn't have the resources to fight it. The foundation stepped in, hired a top Atlanta law firm, and within a month, all charges were dropped. The story made local news, and suddenly the foundation was flooded with applications. In its first year of operation, the Thorn Shield Foundation funded the legal defense of over 30 first responders. They represented a firefighter in Oregon who was cited for blocking a road to protect an accident scene. They defended an EMT in Pennsylvania who was disciplined after contradicting a police officer's on-scene assessment of a patient's injuries. They won every single case. The foundation became a powerful force, a watchdog organization that police departments had to take seriously. The threat of getting a letter from a lawyer funded by the Thorn Shield was often enough to make a trumped-up charge or a retaliatory investigation disappear. Marcus found a new purpose in the work. While he continued to work his shifts at Station 29, he spent his off days overseeing the foundation. He would personally call many of the first responders who reached out for help, listening to their stories, offering advice, and reassuring them that they were not alone. He had turned the worst experience of his life into a source of strength and support for thousands of his colleagues. The settlement money had given him the means, but it was the shared struggle that gave him the mission. The Thorn Shield Foundation was more than just a legacy. It was a living, breathing testament to the idea that one person's fight for justice could become a shield for all. The financial settlement was the headline, but the most enduring legacy of Marcus Thorn's lawsuit was written into the operational handbook of the Miami-Dade Police Department. The consent decree, the legally binding agreement that the city had been forced to sign, was not just a suggestion, it was a federal mandate for change. A federal judge would oversee its implementation, and any failure to comply would result in severe penalties, including hefty fines and potential federal oversight of the department. This set of sweeping reforms became known colloquially, first among the cops and medics, and then officially, as the Thorne Directive. It was a complete rewriting of the rules of engagement between law enforcement and emergency medical services. The core of the directive was a simple, unambiguous principle. At an active medical emergency, the senior paramedic or EMT on scene has ultimate authority over patient care. This principle was now codified into police procedure. Police officers were explicitly instructed that their role was to secure the scene and support medical personnel, not to direct them. Any administrative requests, such as gathering information for a report or clearing a roadway for non-emergency reasons, were to wait until all patients had been stabilized and transported. The directive created a new protocol for resolving on-scene disputes. If an officer disagreed with a paramedic's decision, they could not interfere. Instead, they were required to immediately request their direct supervisor to respond to the scene. Likewise, the paramedic could request their own battalion chief. The dispute would then be handled by the supervisors, away from the patient, allowing critical care to continue uninterrupted. Perhaps the most significant change was the automatic review clause. Under the new rules, anytime a police officer arrested or even detained a uniformed on-duty first responder for any reason, it would trigger an automatic internal affairs investigation. The burden of proof would be on the officer to justify their actions as a response to a clear and present threat, not a mere case of obstruction. This single policy shift removed the incentive for officers like Vance to use arrest as a tool for intimidation or to settle a jurisdictional dispute. The cost of being wrong was now too high. The implementation of the Thorne Directive began with a massive department-wide retraining program. Every single one of Miami-Dade's thousands of police officers, from the newest rookie to the chief himself, was required to attend a mandatory 8-hour course. The course was co-taught by a police training officer and a senior fire department paramedic. They walked the officers through the new protocols, explained the legal and medical reasoning behind them, and used case studies to illustrate the right and wrong ways to interact at an emergency scene. The centerpiece of the training was the unedited body camera footage of Marcus Thorne's arrest. They played the entire video for every class. They forced the officers to watch Vance's escalating aggression, to hear Marcus's calm professionalism, and to witness the final, damning admission of an arrest made to teach a lesson. For many officers, it was a deeply uncomfortable experience. They saw in Vance a reflection of a culture that had, for too long, prioritized absolute compliance over common sense and interagency cooperation. The cultural shift was slow and, at times, met with resistance. Some veteran officers grumbled about the new rules, seeing them as an erosion of their authority. They called it the Paramedic Protection Act and complained that it would make it harder to control chaotic scenes. But the department leadership, under the watchful eye of the federal court, held the line. Supervisors were retrained to enforce the new directive, and any officer found to be violating it faced swift and serious discipline. Over time, the changes began to take root. Paramedics on the street noticed a tangible difference. The confrontational attitudes became less frequent. Officers were more likely to ask, "How can I help?" instead of issuing orders. The us versus them mentality began to slowly dissolve, replaced by a renewed sense of shared mission. The Thorne Directive wasn't just a new set of rules, it was the beginning of a new culture, one built on mutual respect and a clear understanding that when someone's life is on the line, the only thing that matters is saving it. It was a legacy written not in dollars, but in procedure, a permanent change forged from one man's refusal to back down. Marcus Thorne never wanted to be a public figure. He was a paramedic, a man who found purpose not in the spotlight, but in the quiet, competent work of saving lives in the back of an ambulance. But his story, amplified by the massive settlement and the groundbreaking policy changes, took on a life of its own. The body camera footage, once a piece of legal evidence, became a viral sensation. News outlets, legal blogs, and first responder forums shared the video, and millions of people watched the raw, unfiltered confrontation on the causeway. It became one of an infamous series of videos that exposed the reality of power dynamics in modern America. For the first time, the general public was given a front-row seat to the kind of jurisdictional clash that first responders had been dealing with in secret for years. The video became an invaluable, if controversial, teaching tool. Police academies and paramedic training programs across the country began incorporating it into their curriculum. At police academies, instructors would use it as a case study in what not to do. It was a powerful lesson in de-escalation, interagency cooperation, and the legal and financial consequences of letting ego drive decision-making. For new recruits, Officer Vance became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the kind of officer they should never strive to be. In paramedic schools, the footage was used to teach students about their legal rights and responsibilities. They analyzed Marcus's calm demeanor, his precise language, and his unwavering focus on his patient in the face of extreme provocation. He became a role model, an example of how to maintain professionalism and advocate for a patient under unimaginable pressure. Soon, the invitations started pouring in. National EMS conferences, university criminal justice programs, and civil rights organizations all wanted Marcus to come and speak. At first, he was hesitant. He was a private person, uncomfortable with public speaking. But Alani Jackson and the board of his new foundation convinced him of the importance of his voice. He was no longer just Marcus Thorne, paramedic. He was a symbol of a movement. He reluctantly agreed and discovered he had a gift for it. He didn't speak like a polished politician or a fiery activist. He spoke like what he was, a paramedic. He told his story with a quiet, matter-of-fact dignity that was more powerful than any rehearsed speech. He would stand before audiences of thousands, medics, cops, lawyers, students, and walk them through the events of that day, not with anger, but with a sense of profound duty. His message was always the same. To the paramedics, he said, "Know your protocols, know your laws, and never, ever apologize for prioritizing your patient. You are their last line of defense." To the police officers, he said, "We are not your adversaries. We are your partners. Our mission is the same, to serve the public. Let us do our job so you can do yours." He never vilified law enforcement as a whole. He was always careful to point out that the vast majority of officers he'd worked with were dedicated professionals. His criticism was focused on a specific culture of unaccountable authority, a culture that Officer Vance had personified. His advocacy work became a new kind of emergency call. Instead of responding to one patient at a time, he was now responding to a systemic illness. He testified before state legislatures that were considering new laws to protect first responders, his personal story giving a human face to the legal jargon. He met with police chiefs and city managers, sharing the lessons learned in Miami. He was no longer just fixing broken bodies, he was trying to fix a broken system. It was a role he had never asked for, born from the worst day of his professional life. But he embraced it with the same sense of duty and commitment he brought to every patient. He had learned that sometimes the most effective way to save lives is not with a trauma bag and a defibrillator, but with a story, a microphone, and the courage to speak truth to power. Years passed. The city of Miami healed. The Thorne Directive became standard operating procedure, so ingrained in the culture of the police department that new recruits couldn't imagine a time when it was any other way. The Thorne Shield Foundation grew into a national powerhouse, a respected institution that had helped hundreds of first responders and changed laws in a dozen states. And Marcus Thorne went back to being a paramedic. He turned down offers to move into administration or to take a full-time role at his foundation. The street was where he belonged. He still worked at Station 29, still drove the same ambulance, still felt the familiar surge of adrenaline when the tones dropped for a critical call. But something inside him had changed forever. He still felt a spike of anxiety whenever a police car pulled up to one of his scenes. His eyes would instinctively search for the officer's demeanor, his posture, his hands. It was a subtle subconscious flinch, the lingering ghost of a trauma he would never fully escape. The scars on his wrists had long since faded, but the memory of the cold steel and the hot shame remained. He was a different man than he had been on that sun-drenched causeway. He was quieter, more watchful. He had seen the fragility of the system he had sworn to serve, had learned how quickly it could turn on one of its own. But he was not bitter. The anger he had felt had been transmuted over time into a fierce, protective sense of purpose. He saw the legacy of his fight every day in small, meaningful ways. He saw it in the young police officer who held a C-spine for him on an accident victim without being asked. He saw it in the police sergeant who rerouted traffic to give his ambulance a clear path to the hospital, calling ahead to let the ER know they were coming. He saw it in the quiet nod of respect from cops who knew his story, who understood the line he had drawn in the sand for all of them. His greatest sense of peace came from the man whose life had been at the center of it all. The man from the overturned minivan, a retired schoolteacher named Robert. He had survived, against all odds. He had a permanent traumatic brain injury that affected his balance and his memory, but he was alive. Every year, on the anniversary of the accident, Robert would visit Station 29. He would bring a box of donuts and a simple handwritten card for Marcus. The card always said the same thing: "Thank you for not giving up on me." For Marcus, that was the only verdict that truly mattered. The money was in a trust. The accolades were gathering dust on a shelf. The fame was a distraction. But that card, that simple expression of gratitude from a man who was alive because Marcus had refused to back down, that was everything. It was the reminder that his choice, made in a split second under unimaginable pressure, had been the right one. It was a choice that had cost him dearly, but it also created a legacy of protection that would echo for generations of first responders he would never meet. He had faced down a broken system and, in doing so, had helped to mend it. The scars he carried were not just his own. They were a map of a battle fought and won for all of them, a permanent lesson in the cost and the profound healing power of doing the right thing. The human mind is a complex machine, especially under pressure. Looking back, it's clear that Officer Vance's actions weren't born in that single moment on the causeway. They were the culmination of years of unchecked aggression, of a system that rewarded dominance over de-escalation, and perhaps a deep-seated personal insecurity that saw any challenge to his authority as a threat to his very identity. He saw a calm, competent black man in a position of authority, and his programming short-circuited. He couldn't process a world where his badge didn't grant him absolute power. Could anything have been done differently? Perhaps. If Marcus had been wearing a body camera of his own, as many paramedics now are thanks to the work of his foundation, Vance might have thought twice before escalating. What if a supervisor had been on scene within the first few minutes? The presence of another authority figure might have been enough to break the spell of Vance's rage. But in the end, the responsibility lies not with the person who followed procedure, but with the one who abandoned it for the sake of his ego. The lesson is not just for first responders, but for all of us. It's about the quiet courage to stand your ground when you know you are right, even when the personal cost seems impossibly high. It's about understanding that true authority comes not from a uniform or a title, but from competence, integrity, and a commitment to serving others. What do you think is the most important change that came from this lawsuit? The money, the policy changes, or the cultural shift it inspired? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between following an order and doing what you knew was right? Share your story in the comments below, and if you believe in the work of protecting our first responders, please consider supporting the channel.